Welcome to Wednesday Wisdom.
Good morning. This is Jos Visser, the author of Wednesday Wisdom. And this week, in honor of Thanksgiving, we are going to discuss a reader question. Dear Jos, a reader who contacted me on LinkedIn wrote, if I may ask, looking back at your career, were there any inflection points where your approach to engineering or leadership fundamentally changed? Whenever reader questions come in, I typically answer them right there and then. But I thought this particular question deserved a longer answer and one that might also be of interest to the wider audience. So here we go. For me, there are basically two important modes of learning. First, when I'm faced with a challenge that is difficult to overcome and that requires some careful thought and planning. Second, after I make a huge mistake. I pretty much never learn anything unless one of these two things is in play. When faced with mediocre challenges that are easy to overcome, I just engage, apply the skills that I have, and then I'm basically just coasting. When this happens, I might get more proficient at certain things, I might sharpen the tools in the shed, so as to speak, I might even become quite good at something that I was already decent at, but there's no inflection point where the trajectory suddenly changes steeply and for the better. Learning, for me, mostly happens when I really have to sink my teeth into it or when I royally F up, requiring a similar effort to improve and fix things. Remember, experience is what you get when you were expecting something else. The first big inflection point in my career, both as a leader and as an engineer, came when I joined Google. At that time, I'd already been working for about 18 years, but most of that work was of the coasting variety that really didn't require a lot of growth to keep up. I did a lot of moderately difficult work in, technologically speaking, moderately complicated environments, and my skills were widely appreciated there, but as a friend of mine later put it, it's not hard to shine in a dim room. This time was by no means wasted because I really did learn a lot about Unix, C, C++, and related topics, and that knowledge later turned out to be essential to pass the Google interview. When I joined Google, I suddenly was no longer in a dim room. Instead, I was now surrounded by absolute geniuses and total wizards. I was also exposed to a technical environment that was orders of magnitudes bigger, more complicated, and more intricate than anything I had ever seen before. Keeping up with my colleagues and with the work required me to get better at a lot of things fast. Unfortunately, as I wrote somewhere else, I'm a terrible ramper-upper, so this took some time. But eventually I got it and I was able to contribute meaningfully using my newly acquired skills. The second inflection point came when I finagled my way into the pool of facilitators of Google's Technical Leadership Program, EDGE. By virtue of my personality, I have some natural leadership talent, but attending and later facilitating EDGE exposed me to many deeper insights into leadership and also provided ample opportunity to practice these skills in many different situations and with many different people. Again, working with absolute geniuses in the field of engineering leadership and being required to keep up and contribute provided a challenge that I could only overcome by growing fast. When I left Google and joined Facebook, I was suddenly exposed to a completely different company, using completely different technology and doing things completely differently. I grossly underestimated the problem of ramping up as a senior person in another organization, and that almost got the better of me. Fortunately, it wasn't all bad, and some colleagues from my Facebook days who I still see will say nice things about me, which I'm grateful for, but I definitely fell short of my own expectations, and that is all that matters to me. One of the things that I had realized before, but which only really came alive for me after my switch to Facebook, is that there are a lot of people who are really valuable to a company, but if you look at it in a bit more detail, they're only valuable to that specific company because of their in-depth knowledge of how things work in that company and because of their deep personal network, again, in that specific company. In the past, I'd worked with project managers who were quite successful in the company we worked for, but who, all things considered, were really not great project managers at all. They just had decades of experience getting things done in this organization. They had a huge mental map of all people, all processes, and a large wallet full of IOUs that they could cash in when things got a bit hairy. I loved working with them, but I also realized that they would probably not be very effective anywhere else. I almost fell into that same trap because over the years, things at Google were trending in the same direction for me, and when I moved to Facebook, I suddenly knew nothing anymore. As a senior engineer, your effectiveness depends on your in-depth knowledge of the technology stack and your deep network of people in the organization. When you start somewhere else, you have neither. Fortunately, I dug myself out of that hole and learned from it, creating another inflection point in my engineering and leadership skills. These new skills came in super handy when, a few years later, I joined Amazon and was able to ramp up and become effective much faster. Another inflection point happened when I joined a startup as a senior principal engineer and unfortunately did not do a great job. Eventually, I got laid off because I was probably their most expensive, but definitely not most productive engineer. Lots of things went wrong there, and that deserves a postmortem of its own, but I did learn a lot, especially about how useful I can be for a smallish company that has big problems but not enough time and money to address them. Answer: not very useful. When I joined, they probably had big expectations of what I could do, but as it turns out, there's not really a lot I can do on my own. One of the things I learned is the importance of asserting yourself as a senior person and demanding a seat at the table. And if you don't get it and feel that you cannot do anything useful that justifies your cost, leave. Another thing I learned is that it is really important whom you report to. So there it is. To bring it back to the reader question, were there any inflection points where my approach to engineering or leadership fundamentally changed? Answer: yes, many. And they were all related to situations where I was in over my head, because when you have to sink or swim, that is when you learn. Happy Thanksgiving.